Thank you for coming today to the commemoration for Harry Elbert Harden. Harry was a Banstead boy. His dad was a Banstead lad as well. Family been in the village for many generations. His mother, Matilda, was born in Woodmansterne. She was in service in Epsom when she met Harry's father, Amos. Amos was a worker on the asylum on Banstead Downs. He worked in the fields as a labourer there. We've talked about the asylum quite a lot recently. We know that the small labour force that were out there working in the fields to make the asylum self-sufficient in terms of food were helped out by maybe about 100 inmates every day who were working as part of their occupational therapy. Many asylum workers lived in Salisbury Court, what is now known as Salisbury Road, at the end of the village high street. Very different road in those days. It's only about half the length that it is now. It ended about halfway down the hill. And it joined directly onto the high street opposite the Woolpack. Now, Amos and Matilda, after they married, they went on to have 4 children. Harry was the third of them, born in September 1888, baptised here at All Saints at the end of that month. And they lived at number 4, a cottage, which is no longer there today. It's probably one of the victims of the V1 flying bomb that hit that end of the high street during World War II. Harry grew up there. He probably went to school where the old village school was, where Waitrose is now. And after school, he became a carman, driving a horse and cart for a haulage contractor. Now, he was quite sporty in his spare time, and he enjoyed helping out at the Banstead Cricket Club. And he was a scorer there when he was a young lad of about 13 or 14. And there's a photo of him in the 1903 second 11 team photograph with him sitting with his scoring book on his knees. And if you've seen the photo outside the church, that's where that comes from. Now, 3 of the men in that photograph died during the war, and we'll be talking about 2 of the other men's stories later this year. Harry married a Hornsey girl from North London. She'd probably come down to Banstead to work in service. And they married up in Hornsey in late 1911, and they came to make their home in Lyme Regis Road. They lived in Lulworth Cottages, which were new maisonettes. They'd only just been built in about 1909, 1910. Today they are numbers 11 through 23, Lyme Regis Road. There's a pair of semi-detached houses, number 11 and 13, and then next to them there's a row of 5 houses divided into 10 maisonettes. Now, maisonettes are very unusual in Banstead. In fact, they were probably the very first ones to be built in this village. And so there were young people there, young couples living there, and actually single women living there as well, which was very unusual in those days. It was probably the most affordable modern houses in the district, in the Banstead town village at the time. And they moved into what were then number 4, and which is now number 17 and number 17A. And they lived either upstairs or downstairs from one of the other men in that cricket photograph, George Blunt, who we'll be talking about, unfortunately, very soon. Harry joined the Royal Garrison Artillery during the war. He was a Derby scheme man. The peak of enlistment had come very early in the war, in September of 1914, and the numbers of volunteers had then trailed off quite dramatically since then. So a new scheme was launched in the autumn of 1915, where men were visited at their homes by a canvasser who'd asked them if they would like to join the army now or whether they'd like to join the army later. And Harry, most of our local men were ones who said, "Oh, I'll join later, thanks very much." But Harry was one of those who said, "Yes, I'll join now." Maybe he was out of work, or maybe he just thought it was his patriotic duty to enlist. And so he found himself next day in Great Yarmouth, beginning his training as a gunner in the Royal Garrison Artillery. Now, the RGA were one of 3 branches of the artillery. The Royal Horse Artillery sort of gallop onto the battlefield with their horse-drawn guns and get into action. And then you've got the Field Artillery, with their 18-pounder, 16-pounder field guns, who sit just behind the lines. And then far behind them, you have the howitzers of the Royal Garrison Artillery. These huge guns that were sort of a cross between a field gun and a mortar. So they had quite stubby barrels. They were huge guns, weighing about 12 tons each. They had these stubby barrels that fired upwards in a high trajectory. They'd been originally designed for siege warfare, to fire over obstacles into fortresses, for example. And they were exactly what the British Army needed on the front line for trench warfare. They could drop shells from a high arc down onto trenches and onto strong points far behind enemy lines. So the battery that Harry first joined was 264 Siege Battery, and they were equipped with these 4 9.2-inch howitzers. They were the biggest standard issue guns, as it were, in the artillery's armoury. We did have bigger guns mounted on railway guns and things far behind the lines, but these were the big boys that were in common use on the battlefronts at the time. They had a crew of about 14 men manning each gun. The shells they fired were so big that it took 4 men to lift the shell to load it into the gun. They were quite slow-firing guns. It took a lot of labour to load them and get them aimed and fired. They fired a long way with very destructive firepower, a shell that was about 130-odd kilos of high explosive. They were, as I said, massively heavy things, 12 tons each. They needed very carefully prepared gun positions, so you had to think in advance where you wanted to put your gun, and you needed to know that it was going to be there for a long time. Because if the front advanced too quickly, your gun would never be able to keep up. It would need 3 days to prepare a new position and move up there. And if the front suddenly started collapsing back towards you, there was no chance of you getting your gun out at all, and your men would have to sabotage the gun rather than let it fall into enemy hands. So they went to France in late February and then came to Arras, where the next blow was about to be struck by the British Army. The Battle of the Somme had just finished. We were planning to resume it after winter had eased and the thaw had come, but the Germans had other ideas, and they realised their position on the Somme battlefield was untenable and started withdrawing back, collapsing towards this new line of strategic defences called the Hindenburg Line, very strong fortification. Now, that new line of defences met the old defences at Arras, and that was coincidentally where we were planning to strike in the spring anyway. And we began to modify our plans as the German front fell back. So Harry's battery were fortunately in the right place at the right time for the army, because the Germans were moving troops back into that area, and Harry's was just opposite the corner where the Hindenburg Line met the old defences. It was the most vulnerable point in the German line once the withdrawal had been completed, and the Germans were strengthening that point with extra lines of trenches, fortifying the village of Neuville-Vitasse, and they built a giant defensive redoubt called the Harp, where the old and new lines met. And it was at that point that Harry's siege battery was striking during the month of March. As I said, they had quite a slow rate of fire, so they didn't fire very many shells during the day. They chose their targets carefully, so they weren't wasting their time and wasting their shells. And they were striking at particular trenches around that corner of the line where they joined. In particular, one called the Preußenweg, the Prussian Way, which joined 2 fortified villages together. And they were firing on that to disrupt the communications between those 2 villages. Now, as the Germans fell back, the British advanced behind them. They repaired the crossings over the Somme, and they were eventually able to push through more heavy artillery, vehicles, tanks, and more men. Until by late March, we were in a position to start thinking about launching that offensive finally. Although it had been long planned as an offensive in its own right, it became a diversionary attack for the French, who were attacking down the River Aisne, and they were due to start that attack in the middle of April. We had the British attacking at Arras, and then further along another French army attacking, both diversions to draw German reserves away from where that main blow was scheduled to fall. Unfortunately, plans for that particular offensive had been leaked, and the Germans knew exactly what was happening there. So from that point of view, the plan didn't work. And the attack of the French down the River Aisne was a slaughter that broke the French army effectively as an offensive force for most of the rest of the war. We began a preliminary bombardment, a week of heavy shelling in early April, and we were smashing the front line, the trenches all around Arras, up at Vimy Ridge in the north, and then between the River Scarpe and the River Courgeot, which is the sector that Harry was looking after, and then further along the Hindenburg Line as it curved away. The old line came down north-south, and then the Hindenburg Line swept away to the southeast. They went over the top at 5:30 a.m. on Easter Monday of 1917. The infantry went over, and in some places they were merely able to walk through the German lines. So effective had the artillery preparation been. Harry's group were supporting a Banstead man that we commemorated a little while ago, Alan Guest, who was advancing in the south of the sector, near the River Kerjol. And Harry was firing way over his head. These guns had a range of about 7 miles or something like that. And they were firing about 3 miles in advance of where Alan Guest was advancing. And they were hitting the Montreal switch line, which was a second line of German defences that was part of the British objectives for that day. The British Army eventually reached that line. They didn't breach it, which they were supposed to do. But it still represented a very significant advance. It was the largest advance from a standing start since trench warfare had begun. They went right through the village of Tilloy up to the Montreal switch line in the south, and to the north, Vimy Ridge fell to the Canadian Army, and huge advances were made there as well. Now, it took another day to force their way through that line, and once they got beyond that line, they were beyond the range of the heavy artillery. Those guns in Harry's battery, they would take 3 days to move them to somewhere else. The positions that they had to dig this great big pit, which they'd lay 18-foot long steel girders, like a pair of rails along them. And at one end, they'd reinforce them with this sort of triangular cross-hatching of girders, and they'd build a steel platform on top of that. The gun would be built on top of that end. Then down the other end, they'd build wooden platforms with, like railway sleepers lying across the rails, and they'd have a huge box full of all the earth they dug out from the pit. So there'd be 11 tons of earth at that end, plus sandbags for additional ballast, and then a 12-ton gun at the other end. And the reason for having all the weight down that end was so that when the gun fired, the platform didn't buck up into the air like that. And it meant that they could be extremely accurate, but as I said, it took a very long time to fire them. You couldn't fire these things on the move. They had to be broken down into 3 carriages pulled by Caterpillar tractors. Very slow to move and get into action. So after the British had advanced beyond, the guns sat there for a few days. They didn't have anything to fire at, and they were eventually retasked and moved south. So where the Hindenburg line swept away down to the southeast were the Australians of the Anzac Corps in 5th Army. And they had not attacked on the first day of the Battle of Arras. They were due to go in a couple of days later with flanking attacks around the village of Bullecourt. They did so, the first of those attacks, the first day before Harry's battery arrived on the scene. It was not a success. The Germans knew they were coming. They were well prepared. The Australians did get a foothold, but a German counterattack soon drove them back out again. And there was never very much progress made on that front. But Harry's battery were due to support them. The trouble was they couldn't find appropriate positions. There weren't really any very good ones. They only found one in the end, and there were 2 siege batteries that both wanted to use that position. In the end, it was Harry's battery that got that. It took a long time to get those positions prepared. They had difficulty with the ground because the ground was quite solid. It was frozen because the weather was bad. It was snowing in early April. And I remember on the 9th of April when we had a commemoration, it was blazing sunshine like today. It was snowing in early April 100 years ago. And it took them a long time to get their positions prepared. Their commanding officer and one of the section commanders went off sick, which probably didn't help very much. And it took them 2 days longer than it should have done to get those guns into action. They'd only been firing for about a day when what they called a lucky 77mm shell landed just in front of the battery. There was hardly any other shelling of the battery. The Germans had been so ravaged by the British artillery fire at the time that they were able to, at Arras, they weren't able to fire much back at us. So it was a very lucky shell that landed just in front of Harry's battery. It killed one gunner, Gunner Dixon, and wounded 4 men. One of those was Harry, and he'd been hit in the head by a bit of shrapnel. So he was evacuated for treatment back to No. 3 Stationary Hospital in Rouen. It was far from the front line. It was almost halfway back to England. He was only there for a few days before he'd recovered, and he was posted back to an RGA base. And then he was returned to duty on the 8th of May, just about a fortnight after he'd been wounded. This time he joined another siege battery. He joined No. 281 Siege Battery, who were equipped with much lighter guns, 6-inch howitzers. Now these were on wheels rather than these pre-prepared positions, and they were much more mobile, much more flexible about what they could fire. They had a higher rate of fire. They did have a shorter range. They weren't as accurate because they were on wheels and they'd move when they fired, unfortunately. But they were ideal for another part of the battlefield that we were just about to launch a new offensive in. When Harry joined his battery, it wasn't at Arras, it was up north at Ypres. at the Ypres salient. This semicircular bulge in the lines around the old market town of Ypres. The Germans had all the high ground, the British and the Allies had all the low-lying, marshy, boggy ground. And it was that ground that made that situation much more favourable for these lighter guns, because you couldn't really dig these pre-prepared pits in there, because they just flood with water. And the ground was so muddy and soggy that they'd move around anyway as they fired. And the whole area was under artillery observation from the Germans, so you needed to be able to move pretty quickly in those circumstances. So when he joined them there, it was a baptism of fire, because they were hit by several hundred rounds just within the first few days of Harry joining them. Now, they were quite lucky, really. There were very, very few casualties, so they must have had quite a lot of protection. We know that they dug shelters and things like that to squirrel themselves away when danger threatened. Now, they were at Ypres, or the British had been at Ypres since very early on in the war, and we'll talk on Wednesday about how they got there. We haven't visited Ypres very much lately. We've been on the Somme and the Ras, but we're going to spend most of the rest of this year up at Ypres, because it was where Douglas Haig was planning to strike his next blow. What he would like to have done, and what he would have liked to have done for quite a long time now, was to smash his way north to the ports of Ostend and Zeebrugge on the Channel coast, which the Germans were using as naval bases. And he believed that this was where the war would be won, that this was the vulnerable point. And so as Arras was winding down gradually, he was moving men north up to Ypres. So Harry's battery were there to support this coming offensive, and their job was mostly counter-battery work, so they'd be firing over the German front lines and at the batteries, artillery batteries, behind there. They had a range of about something like 5 or 6 miles, these guns, not as far as the other ones, but far enough for what was needed for this particular job. And because they were mobile, they could keep up with that advance as if and when it happened. One of the stumbling blocks to this huge new offensive was that, as I said earlier, the high ground was held by the Germans. Now, if you were looking up to the ridge from Ypres, if you were looking due east, you'd have low ground to north, you'd have a ridge sloping up in front of you, the village of Passchendaele, which you've probably heard of and we'll talk a lot more about this year, and along the ridge, and then it would curve around to your right, and there would be a high ridge over there called, there'll be Hill 60, a high point, and then a high ridge, which is Messine's Ridge on your far right. And it was that particular position that we needed to dislodge the Germans because it was from there, particularly, that they could observe our troops building up for the offensive. They knew we were coming, but if we could at least shield ourselves from their view, then we'd have protection from their artillery, and also we could slightly conceal our intention about where exactly the blow was going to be struck. And so on the 7th of June, we blew 500 tons of high explosive, 19 deep mines under Messines, on the 7th of June, under Messine's Ridge, we blew 500 tons of high explosive deep mines, and they made an enormous noise. It was the biggest explosion that was made until the first atomic test, and it could be heard by Prime Minister Lloyd George in 10 Downing Street when it blew, and the ground shook for miles around, completely wiped out the German defences, and the attacking forces were able, sometimes just to stroll across. They advanced about 2 miles that day. It had taken 2 years to get us to the point where we could blow those mines. So it wasn't exactly a strategy we could repeat if we were going to end the war, well, within 100 years or so, probably. But it was a great success. And Harry's battery was supporting that attack. The attack was on quite a wide front, and the northern tip of that was the responsibility of 10 Corps, which Harry's battery was supporting. And they were firing over this ridge in front of Ypres to hit the German batteries behind. And their fire was very, very effective. And there was hardly any artillery retaliation on the British infantry as they advanced. They were firing something like 600 shells a day, far more than his old guns had been able to fire. It was hard old work, and they were getting quite a lot of guns that were off to their left, far to the north. They were able to fire because all the British were concentrating their fire that way. They were getting a lot of fire coming in from the north, all kinds of different guns firing. I'm amazed that the officers that keep the diary, who are under shell fire, were able to differentiate between 3, 4, 5 different types of guns that were firing at them at the same time, and carefully note all that information down. Their ammunition dumps were hit a couple of times, caught fire. One time, the fire was so bad that the men couldn't get to it to put it out in time, and shells started firing off at the other guns in the battery. The command post was hit, the shelters were damaged, but still remarkably few casualties. And during the entire Battle of Messines Ridge, they had one slight wound and one man killed. The battle ended on the 14th of June. It had achieved virtually everything they set out to achieve, a great success. And as the infantry advance stopped, the guns carried on, stuck to their tasks, but they started winding down a bit, not firing quite so many shells. Harry's battery were in the north of Ypres itself. They were essentially sitting ducks for the German guns up on the ridge and off to the north, because they could see exactly where they were. And so, as I said, they were getting lots of this shelling coming in. And on the 18th of June, number 3 gun, Harry's gun, was hit and the gun layer injured. And then the next day, a shell struck again, and Harry was hit again. This time, he was once more hit in the head, evacuated again to 17 Casualty Clearing Station at Remy Siding, near the Belgian town of Lycentor. He arrived sometime about midday and died later that evening. He was 29 years old. We're now going to ring the bell 100 times in memory of Harry.